Saad, and eager to hear from you about your work with systems engineering.
Is that my cue to jump in then, David? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, please.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much for having me. It's nice to be part of this group again. We've had several conversations over the past several weeks that have led to, the edges of these worlds, looking at kind of the economic scale, the organizational scale, and perhaps me saying too much. And it's prompted, I guess, this session, which is bringing us to my area of focus, which is really the organizational scale. So a big thanks to Sage, Juliet, and David for teeing this up, and it's a privilege to have the chance to present a little bit. I'm a bit daunted by kind of trying to find the right level of focus with some specificity and examples in about 15 or 20 minutes. So bear with me, I'll do my best. Most of my slides are really just placeholders to have some sort of a visual cue. I'm going to try and keep this rather conversational. Hopefully we can have a little bit of a discussion at the conclusion. So just in terms of alignment, I wanted to state maybe what's obvious for me at least. When I look at the paradigm or the coalition and this idea of a new paradigm, I think there's a strong alignment between it and the work we do, in that we do see the world as a complex adaptive system, relate to it that way in terms of how we make sense of things, and we absolutely leverage evolutionary science to inform our perspective on how organizations need to transform in order to engage with the world as it is, and to create the desired future that we're looking for. There is a gap, however. When we take, I think, sort of these broader economic points of view, and I think there are quite a few movements like this one now, as David and I and others have been discussing, that apply systems thinking, evolutionary sciences in terms of how we can make sense of the world in a more accurate and reflective way. And often there are additional innovations, movements, groups that are trying to appeal to an organizational crowd, organizational leaders trying to appeal to management. And I think they fall down in a couple of ways. So one, I see these innovations translate into frameworks or methods that really don't go past the sort of level of a macro scale very effectively. So if we look at something like the donut economics model or the SDGs, they attempt in rather overtly simple ways to explain the theories and provide guidance on how to apply them at an organizational scale, but they don't really translate well. There's an immense complexity that comes with making sense of, so, say, global thresholds at the scale of an organization, and overstepping that usually just results in leaders adopting the same incremental approaches, targets, goals, et cetera. And we'll share an example that kind of brings that to light in a moment. And the other way is we see lots happening around problem solving. So taking these sort of bigger ideas of the world as a complex adaptive system and beginning to take systemic approaches to problem solving. And it's wonderful, if we get into community issues or issues at the scale of supply chains, et cetera, having more sophisticated approaches to problem solving is very necessary, and applying systemic practices is very useful. But what ultimately happens is we run into the inertia of the existing operating structure. So the organization has a way of budgeting, planning, thinking, decision-making that is pre-existing and is very much informed by the current paradigm of management. And so when we step out and deal with a problem set in a systemic manner and come back into the organization, there's a lack of compliance. And generally, what we might solve, the solution we come up with maybe doesn't work for how things are then going to play out in the organization. So we need something more. This to say, I'll first introduce a little bit of my background. So I'm the executive director of an organization called the Flourishing Enterprise Institute at Wilfrid Laurier University in Ontario, Canada. And essentially, we're much like this group about 12 years ago. There's a whole bunch of people who started to step into a room from different places in the world who are all interested in advancing organizational management. And what we maybe couldn't have said then that has become more clear now is that we have a shared and common interest in applying systems theory and the natural and social sciences to evolve or innovate how we practice organizational management. And not at all in a pie in the sky sort of theoretical way. Most of the people in this community of practice come from 20, 30, sometimes 40-year careers in certain areas of management, working as consultants with a deep appreciation and understanding for what underpins the practices that they lead and help to facilitate, and have spent, in many cases, upwards or more than a decade conceiving of how we might recast a management function by applying systems theory and the natural and social sciences in a practical and pragmatic way. I'll share two quick examples. One is the work of my colleague Anthony Upward, who created the Flourishing Business Canvas. So he looked at Osterwalder's popularized business model canvas, recognized very simply as a business architect that it isn't sufficient for the complexity of the world, and began a line of inquiry asking, well, what would a business model look like if it was truly considerate of our reality, as in all of the complexity that exists in the world? And added another 6 categories, a whole bunch of more sophisticated questions, and created the Flourishing Business Canvas, which I encourage you to take a peek at if you're at all interested in the area or the function of business modeling. Another is my colleague Mark McElroy, who created a methodology called context-based sustainability. So he's a third-year management accountant, was a partner with KPMG, wasn't very pleased with what his work was doing as a net impact on the world. He quit his job, did a PhD at Groningen in the Netherlands, ended up working with Donella Meadows for most of a decade, came up with theories of multi-capitalism, and eventually developed context-based sustainability as a form of integrated triple bottom line management accounting that was designed to take a systems lens in the natural social sciences and make sense of them based on the current practice of management accounting. So, context-based sustainability is likely to overwhelm a sustainability professional, but as an approach, it makes a heck of a lot of sense to a CFO or a CEO because it's couched, it's designed, it's oriented in terms that make sense to someone who practices strategic management as a function. So, as part of what the FEI does, the Flourishing Enterprise Institute is really here to bring these systemic management innovations forward into the world. So as an applied research institute, we bring study to the practical application of these innovations in the field with an interest in developing a new body of evidence and accelerating the development of these innovations because they are quite complex. And as I'm sure you can imagine, we're not going to get them perfectly right and have them be very easily applicable in any context at first blush or based on the first attempt. So there's a degree to which there's a lot of learning to do, and having applied research accompany the work of these innovators is very necessary. In addition, we also have a growing community of practice, as we're doing here, which is designed to help bring awareness to these innovations and create more opportunities for testing and applying them in the field. So as you can see here, we just distinguish this idea of a systemic management innovation very simply. We're publishing on the topic for the first time at the moment. The idea is simply we take an area of strategic management, we use systems theory to recast it, apply the natural and social sciences, one of the distinguishing characteristics of these systemic management innovations is that they are practical, they're not theoretical, and the necessary guidance is there to steward a transition in real practice on the ground. And ultimately, they're designed to lead to more integrated, collective, and adaptive practices. Again, a bit more of a placeholder than something useful. Sometimes we use this iceberg model to depict leverage theory, often recognizing that when it comes to most sustainability-oriented effort, the work is peripheral. The projects, the initiatives tend to be, and in this case, where the iceberg was customized for a municipal audience focused on climate change, so please ignore that a little bit. But most of the projects end up happening at a pretty high level. They're projects and initiatives. We're not really engaged in rethinking or challenging how things are done in general. And the results are we end up with very incremental progress. And so, our theory of change, we'd say if we want to make any meaningful change, we need to get down to the mindsets of leaders and how people make sense of the world. And when we can begin to help leaders to appreciate why applying a systems lens and really seeing reality for what it is in all of its complexity, we have the opportunity to optimize our strategic management practices in a better way. And so the opportunity then becomes to adapt strategic management practices. And our view is when we can displace and reform or evolve those strategic management practices at the core of the organization, the trajectory, the progress that we make will fundamentally transform as well. And so to add one additional layer, finally, I want to introduce enterprise evolution. So our recognition is that having systemic management innovations on their own is not really going to transform anything. The complexity involved in going into an organization, appreciating the context that exists, their sets of challenges, their constraints, their problems, their opportunities and motivations is something very different. And so, our recognition has become that the opportunity lies in developing new management practices. So systemic management innovations resemble an innovation and an opportunity. And really the skill involved, or the necessity, is that there is a very refined and effective form of facilitation that helps leaders to grapple with this new view of reality, to make sense of it, and ultimately to pick up innovations that make sense in their context and to figure out how to use those innovations, respecting their current constraints, limitations, motivations, et cetera, to design new practices and to use those practices to develop experiences that lead them to learning and building new capabilities. And that's really what this program is all about. It is a transformation program that's about building capabilities through facilitation and creating experiences. It's a bit of a divergence. Actually, it's an intentional divergence from traditional management consulting, which generally creates dependency and extracts capability from organizations over time, towards enabling organizations to stand on very different footing and to have capability for managing the future in a different way. So this speaks a little bit to what enterprise evolution is about as a program. It's very high level. You can see here this window of strategic management on the left. The idea of enterprise evolution is that we're covering the whole. So we're not just interested in transforming a facet of management or certain aspects. We're thinking about what does it take, what would it take to lead an organization from current state towards an evolutionary organization in a future state. And so there's the transformation of strategic functions, a complete transformation of how relationships exist in that organization, both across the organization and with the outside world, and then the development of a new culture. There's that evolutionary culture piece, a new culture and the necessary capabilities in order to function in a very different way. So the nature of the program is such that we have a very collaborative approach to managing the program, in that we put the organization in the driver's seat. The programming itself is very progressive and adaptive. So because what we're doing is emergent and rather complex, it's not clear how we might envision a change happening over the course of a year or longer. So in many cases, the way that we design is responsive and adaptive to what unfolds in practice, because the reality is how organizations and leaders respond to this kind of work will vary quite differently based on the organization and space. And ultimately, the capability development focus that I mentioned. So I want to quickly share a couple of examples that might help to bring some of what I've said in very brief terms to light. So we just finished a 3-year process of working with the senior leadership team of the city of Kitchener in Canada. And I want to start with the appeal. So we connected with the head of strategic planning there, who was really interested in our approach in leveraging systemic management innovations to transform strategic planning, but quickly recognized that if this was going to happen based on the scope of the change, she needed her entire senior leadership team on board with the process. And so we were given an opportunity in the midst of the pandemic, no less, to run 3 half-day workshops with their senior leadership teams. And essentially what we did was we had a conversation about their current challenges, what they feel vulnerable about as leaders, their priorities, their interests, and where they feel, they're struggling. And I mean, it's no surprise anymore. We've heard this consistently. Leaders are daunted by rates of accelerating change and increasingly complex issues consistently emerging. And they don't feel as though they can generate the same performance outcomes they once could using the same practices. So they felt largely exposed based on the complexity of what they're managing. And so in that space, we introduce various systemic perspectives. We start to explain why that's so and help them to see that things are only going to become far more complex and overwhelming, and give them the opportunity to decide if they want to wait until it's too late or begin experimenting and testing and learning now in anticipation of things getting worse. And I think we're maybe 5 or 6 hours into engaging with a pretty diverse range of senior leaders in terms of how progressively minded and maybe the opposite they were. And they were already convinced that, it just made sense to begin this process of experimentation based on a recognition that they need to get good at managing for complexity. And so I would say from a facilitator's perspective, the whole transformation is not about managing for complexity. It's something much more than that. But as a starting point, that is an appeal that I think we have consistently experienced leaders become motivated by. And while they're not yet clear how a systems lens can lend to their ability to manage very uncertain and volatile futures, they're at least motivated to begin doing things very differently. And instead of being in a sustainability department somewhere, we're speaking to senior leaders about very different practices, and there's an openness there. And so we went through this process of developing with them, facilitating the process of developing their strategic plan and their new vision, the 20-year vision, 4-year strategic plan. And the results were also very interesting. While, if I could point to very briefly, maybe the most exceptional outcome was how, through a variety of interactions, leveraging multiple different processes and systemic innovations, they developed a clarity. So traditionally, they would develop a strategic plan, a 4-year strategic plan, like most municipalities, where they would have a whole set of actions that they would have cast in line with some wide community goals. What they came to realize was that it made no sense to set a whole bunch of actions at the start of 4 years for a 4-year term, that strategy was just overlapping a whole bunch of other planning processes within the municipal context, and that ultimately, if they wanted to be at all sincere about their commitment to the vision they had for their community, they needed a strategic planning process that wasn't about actions. It was about setting priorities based on conditions emerging in the community, both needs and opportunities. And so strategic planning literally transformed from a process designed to set a whole bunch of actions in line with community goals to a cross-organizational process of priority setting that was going to then influence how all other planning processes in the organization transformed. They recognized that community goals couldn't be achieved by the organization on its own, and the necessity to now work with many other actors and stakeholders for their own ability to prioritize what made sense strategically to be both sincere and optimal. So without getting into any more detail, I guess what I want to offer is that it was clear to us that going through the process and the experience and leveraging these different innovations along with effective facilitation resulted in deeply rooted system structures breaking down and moving, and things that would have never changed about how they think about planning and decision-making and budgeting starting to transform. And so we see this as a very small first step in a long transition, but the idea being that it is an iterative one, and that it needs to be that way, ultimately based on this truism that we've established. And I'm curious, maybe it's an interesting stopping point, but I think about the layers or the levels at which systems theory can be applied to navigate or understand the complexity of our world. And the rule of thumb we've established is that essentially, if we could, for argument's sake, say there's 20 layers at which we could do this, there's really no way of getting an individual to see, meaningfully make sense of anything more than 3 layers from where they are today. And in the space of these municipal leaders, they were able to see managing for complexity as sort of an approachable layer. And we could stretch them a certain distance. But as soon as we tried to stretch them to our own perspective as to how systems theory applies, we lose them immediately because they can't make sense of it. So the skill really came in recognizing where they were, challenging them and pushing them to a certain level of ambition, getting them to appreciate and see the benefit of going that route by having practical experiences and doing their work in different ways, and then establishing a new foundation from where they see the rest of the world. And then again, going through the process of engaging and exploring how to next challenge them a step forward and continuing that iteration. At least that's how we've seen it. So I'll pause there. I'll just mention, in terms of this work, there's tons of learning to do. I know, David, when we left off the last time, you said what might be interesting for this session was to think about what this group could do and what we might need from this group in order to advance. And what I would say is, we see so many groups out there and that are doing great work, that are interested in engaging with organizations, getting them excited and motivated about more systemic approaches. Our view is that they're usually lacking the practical innovations that are truly necessary in order to enable the development of more systemic practices in real and meaningful ways that optimize outcomes. We have this emerging field. We're conducting applied research. we're lacking funding. We need more supporters and partners. We want to scale our work in testing. We want to work with others who are interested in the same discipline and areas of inquiry. So there's a lot of different ways others can get involved. Most of our work is done on a sort of Creative Commons basis, in that we're not interested in intellectual property. We're interested in scaling impact fast. So our work is very public, transparent, and in most cases, it's being done inside of multifaceted partnerships where there's really an opportunity for almost anyone to get involved if they have a meaningful way of contributing and a sincere interest in the objectives and outcomes that we're pursuing. I'd love to share another example possibly on the performance management front and in terms of making sense of the SDGs and the donut, but I'll pause here, and maybe if a question comes up related, I'm happy to maybe share another example, but would love to hear from the group. Thank you so much.
Okay, great. Let's stop sharing the screen for a moment so we can see each other, and then see what the questions are like. Here we are. Yes, unsurprisingly, as people are lining up. So, Graham, please.
Thank you. Yeah, it's the usual suspects. Juliet, maybe next time you should issue a warning and say, all of the usual suspects, please wait until the end. So I just want to put in a quick question, which might unpack another entire conversation. But I noticed that you said managing for complexity and not managing complexity. And I'm curious to hear if you could unpack that a little bit more, and in particular, how that is received, that distinction.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. I'll start by saying I'm not an academic, though many of my closest collaborators are. I would say that's more their phrasing than mine, and it's probably terminology we wouldn't ever use with a client. So I don't think it really has much significance in, at least in my story of enterprise evolution. It probably means something much more significant to my colleagues who work in the systemic design arena. And perhaps the conversation with Dr. Peter Jones would be useful, but I'm perhaps not the one to do the unpacking today, Graham. I'm sorry.
Okay, great. Chip? I think you need to unmute, Chip. Not yet.
Use the chat too, and we can dictate it.
Maybe we should proceed.
Should I go ahead with the next question, and then we?
Yeah, I think go ahead, Jan, and then if Chip can come back, hopefully.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for the presentation. I just have a question whether you could give an example more specific. I mean, you talked about them, but kind of an example, what was really changed very concretely, let's say in a budgeting system or anything, like what kind of, how did they work beforehand and what happened afterwards? And another question related to that is, do you have any evidence kind of that you can show through the change, that the performance really improved, whichever that performance would be, whether it's the financial performance or any other kind of, how do you measure that, or how do you kind of show that also to your clients?
Fantastic questions, Jan. Thank you so much. So in terms of the long view, sort of the results or the impacts of the changes that we facilitated, we're not at that stage in terms of our applied research. We just finished the process around January, and City of Kitchener would be the first organization that has gone through an elongated transformation program of this nature. So I guess the results are more of a to be determined, if I'm to be fair. But in terms of some of the more concrete changes, this offers a bit of a summary of the before and after, and I'll try and highlight a few things that maybe offer a bit more substance in terms of real changes that happened. So typically, the municipality, like most, would create a vision that's more of a branding exercise than anything grounded in the sciences. You know, they come up with their 3 adjectives that describe the city of the future that they want to create. And what the city came to understand based on our interactions was the fact that, you know, they were clearly creating a vision for the place. So as a municipal corporation, they serve the place, but their interest is for something greater than themselves. Their vision is for Kitchener, the place. And so really it was about enabling that city to flourish. And so on the basis that they established this vision, which clearly was defined based on understanding that there's real terms or real conditions under which their community would be thriving or flourishing, it forced them to really rethink the goals that they set. So they generally come up with broad community goals about, you know, mobility or people's feeling of inclusion, a thriving environment, et cetera. And they exist as reasonable goals that everybody can buy into, but then they don't have any means for actually measuring what those goals actually are and how they're doing against them in real normative, localized terms. And this is where performance management practices and innovations become very necessary. And furthermore, what they realize is they generally look at those broad goals, and like most municipalities, they would essentially aim to pacify them all. It's the nature of measurement reporting in most domains where we have a whole bunch of prescriptive indicators aligned with goals. And the idea is make progress on all of them, demonstrate that you're doing better, do better than your competing or fellow organizations as part of showing some leadership. And what we're lacking is a science and ethics-based frame for determining exactly how we're performing in the current context, then prioritizing what's most important to address as a vulnerability or an opportunity, and going to action on those areas. And the reality is those things change very quickly, and they require ongoing monitoring. They require engagement with other organizations because the goals generally don't sit in the hands of the city. So there was a deeper understanding of the complexity of what it is to authentically pursue a vision for their community and hold a purpose as a municipality. Ultimately, it led them to decide that instead of just having a cross-organizational team temporarily to develop a strategy, what they needed was a cross-organizational team to exist ongoingly around each strategic goal that they set, so that there was this sort of collaborative and cross-organizational view of how performance was, or what the performance was, what the opportunities and priorities were, what the other stakeholders were that they needed to engage with, and ultimately a new system for making sense of the world in line with what the organization does, establishing priorities and so forth. And to your maybe first point, I think this all integrates in a really interesting way where typically, as I mentioned, they would have 4 years of actions, and they would sit down through their annualized business planning and budgeting process and look at that whole list of actions and say, like, well, what quarter of them could we prioritize this year so that we're making progress on our strategic plan? So at the end of our strategic plan, we can say we've adopted all of the actions we said we would in line with our goals. And instead of doing that, now they've actually established that the priorities set through the strategic planning process would become essentially what shapes the entire business planning and budgeting process. So they're not casting actions based on their strategic planning process. Instead, they're identifying opportunities and ultimately using their own set of strategic priorities to shape each year in a different manner based on what's actually happening in the community, how they prioritize their allocations of budget and their adoption of projects. And so there's less of an overlap, more of an integration, and ultimately there becomes this scale linking between a really broad, hard to grapple with vision, all the way down to the budgeting measures and actions that they adopt that can be seen and transparently conveyed to the community with a through line. I hope that helped.
Yeah, thanks. So it's kind of a beyond budgeting approach then. Is that what it is? If I can follow up.
Let's stop sharing the screen so we can see each other again.
No, I just meant to follow up whether this is kind of a beyond budgeting process.
When you say beyond budgeting, does that have a specific meaning, or do you just mean that is the process stretching beyond what a budget would manage?
yeah, it's kind of a management process where you disentangle the different purposes that a budget has, and that kind of makes it more flexible and more adaptive. And I felt kind of what you talked about is kind of very much aligned with that. So it might be something that is useful.
Yeah, I guess what I would offer is, we engaged in the strategic planning process as a starting point. It was a starting point for experimenting with different innovations. And the idea was the purpose of the engagement wasn't just to develop a strategic plan. It was to learn through the experience of applying systemic practices. And so the budget was never in the scope of our engagement. But as an outcome of what we learned and experienced, it became obvious as we applied systemic practices that the budget was an impediment. And they themselves recognized it and fundamentally changed a system structure within their organization to enable them to be more adaptive, integrative, and collective. And that's the sort of emergent nature of this facilitation and transformative process that I think is the magic that needs to happen to really get into the roots of change that are necessary.
So I'm sensing that beyond budgeting is a thing in some areas. Can somebody, either Jan or Laurent, just say what is this thing that's actually known as beyond budgeting?
I mean, I know it because it's used in Agile usually. It's being set up by a group of CFOs, of serious CFOs, and usually CFOs are the ones who are in the the roadblocks to a lot of changes. Because they were tired of cascading rolling forecasts every year and cascading a ton of objectives to everyone on a yearly basis. And they figured out that everything was wrong anyway, because all the assumptions were wrong. So they created this thing called Beyond Budgeting, and there are a few books about it, that they would do something much more frequent, and they would update their assumptions according to deliveries to what's going on.
Okay,
And
so a more iterative process, a more rapid iterative process then.
Yeah. And knowing, basically, you may have a yearly budget, but you could at least change the envelopes within the yearly budgets on a regular basis according to what's going on. So
okay.
It's adaptive. It's more adaptive.
Okay. Okay.
But they are still on a quarterly basis, then it's difficult to do faster than that.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, Chip and Grace, and then back to you, Laurent. Still no sound, Chip. We might proceed to Grace then.
What's the sound check from?
What's that?
Who are you missing?
Chip is still muted. He's unable to speak, so we're going to proceed to Grace.
I assume he's able to speak, but he's unable to be heard in this forum. So thanks. First of all, that's really moving. I think that also in many of these circles, and certainly for myself, I tend to be impatient. And it's like, why am I, you're going into these very, straight-laced organizations and actually getting and meeting them where they are and using terminology that they're okay with, whether it's, planning for complexity or whatever, meeting them where they are and actually moving that forward. I think it's really moving also because most of the people in this room are going to be people who are collapse aware and are at the point of being able to accept that. And most human beings are just you can't talk to them about that. Their whole brain turns off. And so I'm really moved by what you're doing. As you were talking about leaders, I think a lot of us are quite aware that the leaders who are in place aren't the right leaders, right? And the kinds of mindset changes that those of us who are able to lead, because you started with this mindset change, right? These are 8 to 10 year changes in mindset that it takes to actually realize how bad it is and also develop the inner strength to do that. How much do you see some sort of recognition that not only do we need to change our systems, but we're going to need to change who the leaders are? And as one of the steps, we aren't actually the right leaders.
So brilliantly said. Thank you for the feedback. I'm glad that it's resonant. I want to come back to this slide. It also connects our work back to the work of prosocial as well. The idea of cultural evolution and really transforming relationships, et cetera. I think one of the points of inquiry for us from a research standpoint is just the limitation of human capability. You know, the reality is we may begin to go down this set of layers, applying system theory in practice and making sense of it. And there's just like a cognitive limitation to what some people can engage with. And so, you know, if the game is truly different and we're trying to engage in the world based on the complexity that's there, it may not be possible for leaders to perform the same function in the way that will become necessary in order to be successful. And I think the challenge is real in there. There's no guarantee that this is something that's teachable. And even if people get it sort of principally, that they can make sense of it themselves and effectively apply it in practice. So I think that's maybe one of these things that's emergent. At some point, we'll be working with enough clients and going far enough that there'll be conversations about, well, what do we do about the dead weight or the people who can't seem to get this? How do we resolve the fact that we need people that are more capable in their places, et cetera? I think it's a really great point. Thank you.
Yeah. Laurent.
My question was precisely about the slide that was on display. There is something that I found very interesting is culture and capabilities, and the fact that they are two different words. Because usually when I work in consulting, we have these capabilities, and everyone has companies measure capabilities, performance, etc. And culture is something else. And sometimes I'm asking myself, and I don't know about you, but shouldn't culture be a capability, like something with an owner, with performance, with something that is not a soft thing, but a strong thing that is managed as any other important topic in the company? Did you manage to have counterparts who are in charge of culture, people who would try to measure something, who associate it to performance, and how does it go with your clients?
If I'm to be frank, we have relatively limited experience working at the level of culture, and I think if anything, David might be the better one to speak about cultural evolution given his expertise. What I want to acknowledge, though, is to your point about culture and capabilities being together. I mean, this window that we represent is it's an oversimplification for the sake of kind of displaying things in a simple and quick way. We think sometimes of capabilities as being both individual and team-based, and a little more measurable and concrete in nature, whereas the culture is maybe something a little more innate and less difficult or more difficult to pinpoint or measure and assess organizationally. But I think our view is that even if you set up the individuals and the teams with the capabilities they need to function differently, there's kind of an overarching culture that the organization has. So if the culture remains mired in risk aversion and a way of operating that really isn't conducive to the way of being that an organization, I think, needs to embrace in order to be effective in this more emergent and adaptive way of managing, then the culture itself will impede those capabilities from being fully utilized. But we put them at the same level. And I think the last thing I'll mention just about the rings is that the further out we go, the more complex the change and the deeper into systems thinking and theory I think we get. So the simplest starting point is with the management functions at the core, because that's easy to embrace and see the potential benefit of, et cetera. And I think as we go further out, we get into things like self-consciousness and awareness and a broader understanding of the organization, which is obviously a bigger challenge to address. Thank you for the question. I hope that helps.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
I mean, I like it, even though I like it that you frame it from the beginning as something important, because it sets the stage for. And you talk about culture implicitly when you talk about practices, because it's the visible part of cultural states. It's there, and I think it's the thing that we always struggle to find the right counterpart in a company that takes it seriously. Thanks.
Yeah, when I look at all of this, and Randy, we've interacted a lot, so I'm reasonably familiar with what you're doing. I see an excellent mapping onto multi-level conscious, multi-level cultural evolution as I see it. And some of the major elements that are needed is, first of all, whole system evolution requires, I mean, adaptation at the level of the whole system requires selecting at the level of the whole system. So it begins with a whole system change effort, and it must be highly experimental. It must be highly iterative. And if the system is a large-scale system, such as a large organization, much less a city, then it's going to have to be multi-level and multi-context. The same systemic iterative approach is going to have to occur multiple levels, multiple contexts, all with the coordination of the larger unit in mind. So it seems to me that's what you're doing, however you frame it, and you frame it in close to that language. So I think even the narrative part of it is close. I'm guessing that the challenges of doing it are so great that probably assessing it is something which could be improved upon if one had the resources to do it. And so I think the actual turning something like this into what would count as scientific research and cultural evolution that could, be published in some kind of peer-reviewed journal would require more work, but would be well worth doing if possible. And so just eager to explore what would it mean, if basically if this could be more resources could be put onto this, what form that would take. And I guess I'll stop there. Yeah, I have more to say, but maybe I'll just stop there and get your reflections on those.
Appreciate it so much. I mean, in terms of how you've depicted or summarized the relationship between what we're doing and the broader terms and ideals that we share, I think you're spot on. In terms of bringing this forward, I mean, that's exactly where we sit. I mean, I would say we still work very much on a shoestring, and that nobody has decided this is the future and has decided to invest in it significantly. But we've secured Social Sciences Humanities Research Council funding in Canada consistently and continue to bring applied research to our work. And we're in the process of publishing, but we're not working at the potential that we could be if someone appreciated the potential in the vision that we have for the project and its potential to be mobilized at scale very quickly as a real solution to make faster means of some of the challenges I think that many are up against. So very open to the possibility of collaborating. We just finished launching a development project for the third phase of Enterprise Evolution. So Enterprise Evolution is really a program. It's nothing more. It's an innovation in and of itself. It is the way that we go about stitching together systemic innovations and facilitating their application in practice. And so we're bringing together a community from across multiple organizations, as well as individuals who are working on a consulting basis, academics, et cetera, who want to work collaboratively to further elaborate how enterprise evolution is defined, to participate in bringing it to market in different ways and in different sectors, and to expand the testing of it in practice so that we can learn more quickly and continue to better understand its potential and its limitations for that matter.
Yeah.
Please jump back in.
Well, I want to report on at the level of single business, this amazing work by the manufacturing firm Barry Waymiller and its many acquisitions. This is one of the big success stories of the conscious capitalism movement. And the salient issue here is what can be done if an enlightened company acquires another company and has that is in a position, now I get an echo, so I'm not quite sure why, is in a position to actually attempt a whole culture change from the top, because that's what they're in a position to do. And that's what Barry Waymiller has done in over 140 acquisitions, which they call adoptions. They're able to transform the culture. It's a much simpler process getting from here to there than you might think. If you have an enlightened top-down, a truly enlightened top-down agent that's in a position to do that. And in my podcast with him, which is on the webpage, I asked him, can it really be that easy? I mean, really, are you telling me you can purchase a corporation that has a very different culture and then just transform it? And his answer was, yeah, it is that easy. It's like giving candy to a baby, he said, because what you're doing is you're taking people who have been disrespected, they haven't been heard, they've been jerked around, and you're offering them a safe and caring environment. And they're very happy to do that. They need very little persuasion. And so that's at the level of, and he can prove it 140 times over. And that's why I'm so eager to take that step from something which has happened, has been documented in words, has been written about in business books and the like, but is not understood scientifically. And if you actually did understand it scientifically, you'd be amazed that this is a cultural process that has happened again and again and again. So I think there's a huge added value towards taking that step, if you can possibly do it, and actually documenting this as a case of positive cultural cultural evolution. But in any case, I'm talking more than asking, but yeah, happy to have reflections from anybody. And then we are at time, so we should probably, let's do a final sign up. Tad, I don't want to call on any particular person, but I'd love to have your perspective on this as we sign off here.
Well, very quickly, David, I'm just listening, and I will be for a little while as I sort of socialize myself into this conversation. As a conflict person who specialized in understanding mass violence for many years, and Grace was talking about how most of us have internalized collapse. I do wonder about the robustness of these approaches in an environment where there is substantial institutional disintegration and very widespread conflict. But I'll leave it at that for the moment and continue to listen and learn, and I'll have more to say probably in coming sessions.
Great. I'm so happy that you're here. Well, would anyone like to sign out in passing? Maybe I could ask some Tally or Anne or people who haven't spoken yet, just to give a brief reflection, if they would. Rebecca.
David, I'm just noticing Chip had his question in the chat.
Yes, please.
Is it worth going back to it, Chip? Would
Yeah,
you?
sure.
Okay, great. So the question is, built on the response to Jan's in more general terms, how do we keep people keep working on the long-term process of shifting their mindsets? In Randy's term, making it authentic and ongoing. It's a very good question. I don't necessarily know that I have the answer, but in terms of our experience, we couch the process as a starting point and really just wading into a new domain. And so the objective is generally to take something that they're working on already. In the case of City of Kitchener, it was their strategic plan. In the case of the City of Nanaimo, they adopted the donut economics model and were trying to use it to inform how they set goals around a 20-year community plan. So we take that context and we use it as a canvas for experimenting with different practices, different ways of doing what they would typically do using systemic innovations. And through that process, where we really put them in the driver's seat, provide guidance and support, the hope is that they begin to learn to practice differently. They build new capabilities and they experience the benefit of acting in systemic ways. And so the conclusion is not the conclusion of the process. The conclusion comes in institutionalizing what they've learned. So we sit down at the end of that process and we say, okay, so what have we taken away that's a virtue, that's a value for this organization? And how can we operationalize that beyond the scope of this 2-year strategic planning process? Where else does it show up? How would it make a difference? And that's where we get into these system structures being addressed in more meaningful ways, because the conversation leads into those broader exchanges. And the hope is, by developing those new capabilities and institutionalized meaningful change, they go from their starting point up here to a point lower in that sort of layered view of how systems theory applies in practice. And from where they stand, they're going to see deeper. They're going to see more of how taking a systemic approach would lend to better outcomes and them being able to perform their own jobs more effectively. And the hope is they remain ambitious and hungry and motivated to continue on this path of experimenting with new and very different innovative practices and innovations.
Yeah, working in situ, I think, is one of the points that you that you made, which is super important. Would anyone like to make a final comment, checking out, please, without me forcing anyone to do so? But I'd love to hear from people that just haven't spoken yet, if we would. Tally.
Oh, fine. I'll say something. No, I'm just kidding. Hi. What kept coming up for me, and just to remind everybody where I'm coming from, I'm in branding and communications background, is, and I really liked kind of what you were just talking about around this idea of first buying into a process, because it's like, you know, anything that's new or challenging kind of a status quo, how we behave, how we think, what is an organization about, kind of gets people's, you know, fear up, and there's discomfort with change, right? And so what I always kind of come back to is like, what's going on at the kind of paleo, you know, human level of in the people who we're trying to, you know, bring along here. And so in the branding process and in my everyday work, we employ a very similar methodology to what you just shared around. We call it design therapy, and it's sort of bringing an institution or an organization, you know, forward into a new idea of who they are, what their existence is for. You know, when we rewrite mission, vision, values, you know, it's often we're kind of trying to help people figure out how to see a new way. And also just think about in like a massive institution, how many people in different levels within that organization have to be brought along and align. And there's just a lot of mistrust often when we walk in the door between people at different levels in, you know, because there's maybe just a misalignment. And so I think it's just interesting, to me. I've been practicing this through brand for the last, you know, 2 decades. And so to see this being kind of in a similar fashion, kind of thought, you know, brought to systems change and organizational change, I just see a real great, you know, alignment in kind of, because brand to me, and it, you know, forgive me if folks have different definitions of it, but brand is really who we are at the core, right? It's what we want. What do we think we are? What do we think we're here for? It's kind of the encapsulation of mission and purpose with how we express it. So I just keep feeling like this is such a potent thing for this group and this community to coalesce around, is really the brand idea here. And maybe part of that brand idea is this methodology, this proven, you know, way of taking our society from here to here, right? And what that method is. So that's kind of just the stuff that's percolating. I don't know if that helps, but it certainly helps me to just say it out loud, I suppose. Thank you.
Well, I love that, Tally. And first of all, I noted the parallelism between what you're doing and what Randy is doing, but also the need for a brand for ourselves is so that we go through this process ourselves is super important. I think one of the most important working groups that we'll be forming, like right away, is a group that's devoted to exactly that, with members of the coalition who want to be involved in it. So, so I think that's super important. And the more that brand is strong, the more you could really authentically say, "This works, friends. This is what you need to do in order for it to work," and be convincing on that point. That's not just branding, but it's the whole scientific authority that comes with it, the whole concept of a paradigm change, so that now it just makes it easier for people to make the commitment to change. So I think that's really, that's what we can look forward to in the very near future. So I'm very excited about that.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Anybody else would like to? Check it out. Going once, going twice. All right, friends. So we'll be in touch between meetings and then welcome you to the next meeting. Hope to see you there. And thank you very much, Randy. And it's great to have this one recorded. And so we're really building up an archive of recordings, which is awesome. All righty. Enjoy.